Two girls were standing on the street, discussing with each other how a young gentleman smiled at one. The girl put her hand to her mouth and said that she didn't even believe her eyes, wiped them just in case, looked again. But it was definitely young gentleman Aaron. The fighters were training on the ground when they continued to talk about how he had been training hard lately, wondering how long it would last. A week had already passed, that at his age it was too early to come to his senses, and this was somehow unexpected. The girl was interested in what had happened to him. The hero looked out the window. The guy was thinking with his eyes closed. He opened his eyes and thought about how he would not allow the tragedy to happen again. Aaron was looking at the magic book and reasoning about how he would never do that in this life. The guy was talking about how 33 years old was the age at which he died in his past life. On a gray day, a window was shown on the second floor when Aaron was thinking about how it all happened. A young man was sitting chained to a chair. A man with a knife was standing next to him. A castle was shown when the guy told about how he was born into the noble Stilgard family who ruled the northern part of Navarro for generations. He remembered the man with a beard. It was his grandfather, the war hero who stopped the takeover of the Paver Empire. His name was Richard. The hero thought about the genius knight with a sword, his father Robin. The guy stood with his back and reasoned that his abilities would not be enough for even the little finger of one of them, a pathetic, simple knight of the third rank Aaron Stilgard. The young man said that although he was not good enough, he became an earl, and in just 3 years he lost everything. People were talking behind his back about how they say that even a puppy can be born in a pride of lions. They were talking about the idiot count who lost everything that the great Stilgard family had, about how he was a fool who had his county completely taken away from him. Aaron was talking about how he was treated even worse than the city homeless and was constantly bullied. He looked down and reasoned that all this was true. The guy was imagining his father and talking about how, although he could not compare to his father, he tried to become at least a good count, but he was deceived and robbed, deprived of both his order and property. The hero was talking about not only this, but also Coons, who had wished him harm since childhood. The beaten guy was breathing with his mouth open, thinking about how he ended up dying at the hands of the mercenaries sent by that son of a bitch, because that bastard Coons had been jealous of him all this time, even after he took everything. It wasn't enough for him. The scoundrel was leafing through the book and asking the guy to show him the book of deals and measurements. He was asking about the fact that there were only blank pages. The guy, with a bloody face, was screaming at him not to touch it. The criminal kicked him in the body and told him to close his mitten. Aaron looked at his hands and thought about how the book of deals and measurements was not just paper. The hero reasoned that this was the family's treasure, allowing them to make trade deals with residents of other dimensions, and if he hadn't been deceived and had used it correctly, he would have been able to raise the family from its knees. The villain stood over the young man and leafed through the book, saying that he believed this pathetic book and gave away all his property, as rumors say, like a man. Aaron looked at some object in surprise and asked to give it to him because it was his. The hero saw how the criminal threw it on the floor. The object was lying on the floor, and the guy thought that it was a wished bookmark. He said that this was one of the trinkets that he received in these deals, and another. The character behind the hero's back raised his finger up and noted that this, of course, is very expensive. But this object can fulfill one wish of your life. Aaron closed his eyes and drove away in his head that, of course, this was a swindler, and what kind of wish could there be at all? The hero thought that since he lacked abilities, he wanted to save the weakening family, at least through such deals. The guy wondered if there's anyone in the world more useless than him. The villain gave him an unknown liquid to drink and wondered what the hero was thinking about. Aaron opened his eyes in surprise, thinking about the healing potion that gave temporary recovery, asked why he was given it. The criminal approached the table with tools and answered that they were asked to play with him as long as possible. They can't just take and kill him. The villain picked up the knife and said that Coons asked to tell him that this was his last gift. The hero clenched his teeth and thought that this was a nasty Coons. The guy thought that he took his title, his property, and that was not enough for him, wondering if he decided to take his life as well. Aaron raised his head, sitting on a chair, and exclaimed that the last of the still gods would die like a dog. The criminal held a knife in his hand and asked if he had gone crazy, claiming that it was even better, because you can't stand it if you're in your right mind. The hero opened his mouth, thinking about what he was. The villain held a flask of red liquid in his hand. Aaron thought that if he weren't such a fool, they wouldn't treat him like that, and the family would be fine. Tears flowed from the guy's eyes as he thought about how if he had just one chance, how he would like to correct all those mistakes. The hero sank into his thoughts, driving away the thought of, if only it were possible to turn back time. Aaron silently lowered his head down. The wish bookmark flashed with a bright light. The system spoke of the will of someone who was facing death, but was not broken to the end and dreamed of correction. This is the condition that was met for the fulfillment of desires. The boy bowed his head down on the chair and was told to say his last wish. The hero sat motionless and silently. A system error message popped up that the owner of the wish was currently unconscious and could not make a wish. A solution was being searched for, and the owner's wishes were being analyzed based on memories. It was said that 3 wishes had been detected, and the severity was being determined. The message said that not even the slightest difference had been detected, and that all would be fulfilled. A bright light was emerging in the darkness. Aaron opened his eyes, looking ahead. He screamed, rising in bed. The hero looked out the window, wondering. The boy looked carefully, and thought that this was the same view from the window that he always saw. The young man opened his eyes wide and said that he had just been killed, continuing to think about the fact that he had been killed by a mercenary sent by Kuntz. The hero turned around, looking at the door, when a voice came from there, saying that it was Isabel, who was asking if he could come in. The guy remembered that Isabel was his maid, who looked after him more than 10 years ago. The girl bowed her head and said that the boss was waiting for the young master. Aaron looked at her and thought that it was really Isabel. The young man looked around and realized that the bedroom was familiar, the decorations from memories. The hero asked the maid how old he was now. The girl was surprised by what she heard, and clarified that he turned 16 this year. The guy thought about how this could be, that he really went back 17 years. Aaron rushed to hug Isabel, screaming. The hero looked at her carefully and asked if she really was Isabel. The girl noticed his tears and asked if he had a nightmare. The boy wiped his eyes and thanked her, thinking that the maid believed in him even when the whole family had lost hope. Isabel opened her eyes wide in surprise and screamed, wondering if this was a new form of harassment. The girl threw her hands up and asked for forgiveness, adding that if she was guilty of something, then let her say so. She was ready for any punishment and would certainly improve. Aaron was confused and said that it was not about that. Memories of him talking to her inappropriately flashed through the boy's head. The hero asked her why she had come. Isabel folded her palms and explained that the boss was waiting for him, noting that he had not been there yesterday either, and this had angered him greatly. The young man turned away and said that he would go. The girl bent down, asking him again. Aaron turned to her and asked why she was so surprised. He'd better not go, right? Isabel looked at him and said that of course not. The hero raised his hand to the side and thought that he did not know how it happened. But he was given another chance. He remembered how he sat chained to the chair, thinking about the minute mistake that led to the destruction of the family and his terrible past that disappeared. The guy thought that now he was Aaron Steelguard, who would try like crazy to change the future. He took the sword in his hands, put it on his shoulder, said that he went. The guy smiled and told the girl that it was a pity his steel muscles were gone, but in general he was not complaining. Isabel looked at him and wondered if he was okay. The Steelguard training ground. Aaron watched the training and thought that the knights that the Steelguards were proud of were still the same as before. The guy opened his mouth, counting that there were 10 of them. The hero closed his eyes and reasoned that he had not valued them before, and simply thought that they were not sweaty old men. A man crossed his arms in front of him, asking him if he had just appeared. It was the captain of the knights, Hunter. The young man looked up and turned to the captain, apologizing for being a little late, reasoning that he was still the same as before. Hunter narrowed his eyes and replied that it did not matter, asking if he had forgotten his promise. He said that he was absent yesterday, so today he would work off 2 days' work. The captain put his hands on his belt and told him to do 50 laps around the field, 1,000 swings, and the same number of injections. And at this time, he got off easy. Aaron looked at him and said that he understood and was doing it. The hero smiled, asking if it was possible to start right away. Hunter looked at him in surprise and thought he would start making excuses again, that this was happening to him. The guy reasoned that the him who put everything off for later had disappeared. He leaned on his knees. The hero pushed off the ground, starting off, talking about how everything went back 17 years ago, and only he had changed. The young man ran quickly and thought that now everything was in his hands. Aaron breathed and thought that he knew the future, so he would try to become better in any way. The hero waved his sword and counted 471, 472. The captain watched him and thought that he was serious. The guy thought that he would stop the misfortunes that awaited him and protect the family legacy. He pulled the sword out in front of him, counting 999. The young man threw the weapon out of his hand, shouting that he had finished counting to 1,000. Aaron lay on the ground and thought about how he had completed his training for the first time. It was hard, of course, but doable. The hero thought about his strengths and weaknesses, and also about the upcoming events, where there was a good chance of success. But first of all, it was necessary to improve his physical fitness. A notification popped up that a new user had been detected. The guy saw a message in front of him asking whether he wanted to initiate a deal between dimensions, accept or reject. The hero was stunned by what he saw and thought about what it was. The captain leaned over and asked if everything was okay with the young master. Aaron pointed at the notification and yelled at Hunter to see if he could see the thing in the air. The captain raised his hand and said that he didn't understand him, he was just pointing at nothing. The hero opened his mouth and asked again if it was true that he couldn't see anything. Hunter looked at him and thought that the guy was seeing things because he was tired. The young man thought, wondering if he was the only one seeing it. Aaron looked ahead and thought about why he didn't understand why it was floating in the air and not in the book, but thought it was worth a try. The hero chose to accept. A magic book appeared. He looked with wide eyes. The guy thought about whether this was a real deal between dimensions and how that was possible if it was in the form of a book. Hunter shouted, calling the hero. The young man looked at him through the magic book. The captain looked at him and asked if he had come to his senses, that he had said something strange, and thought that he was unwell, he needed to see a doctor. Aaron interrupted him. The guy grabbed Hunter by the hand and said that everything was fine. The hero looked away and noted that he was no longer the same as before. The captain looked away and reasoned that he had not noticed such determination in the young master before. It seemed to be the influence of the Stillguard blood. The guy, leaving, turned around and said that he had finished training, so he would go. Hunter bowed and told him to rest. Aaron thought that he did not think that the captain was lying to him, but he saw it too clearly for it to be a hallucination. The hero entered the building, seeing in front of him a notice about the registration process. The man noticed the guy and said hello, asking if he should cook him something to eat after training. Aaron looked at him and replied that he was tired, so he did not want to later. The young man thought about the fact that even the butler seemed not to see. The man looked at him and noticed his eye, from which a strange blue flame was emanating. The guy thought about the blue flame from the eye. Was it possible that the Dimensions transaction book was located right in the eye? The hero waved his hand with a smile and said that this was probably how mana was displayed and nothing like that. The butler replied that it really seemed like just mana. The hero said that he would go. The young man touched his eye and thought that it couldn't be. All of this was right in his eye. The guy exhaled in reason that if he thought about it, it was even harder to believe that he had died and returned 17 years into the past. He looked away and thought about how relieved he was that the butler hadn't noticed anything. Aaron looked ahead in surprise. A notification popped up asking if he wanted to continue under this account. The young man's eye was blazing. He was wondering why there was no reject button, and he spoke about his old ID. The hero clicked on accept, noting that now he could only accept. The message said that a deal was starting across dimensions. A book opened, and it was about the user's description. The guy looked at it with interest and said that he thought so. Everything starts from scratch, and demand and supply are not at all similar. So there is nothing to be done about it because he is in the channel about the system. Aaron, opening his eyes wider, realized something. He was looking at the system window and wondering where he got the coins from. The hero was wondering if this was his previous account, but no, the deal level was not suitable. The guy put his hand to his chin and stated that nothing was clear. The young man's eye emitted a blue light when he thought that he would start with a warm-up. A week later, the hero asked if he wanted to spar with the knight. Aaron later asked if he was serious. The young man smiled and replied that he was. The captain turned to Fred, asking him to keep the gentleman company, but to use only his left hand without mana. While thinking that although the guy had been training hard lately, it was still too early for him to spar with a real knight. Aaron closed his eyes and smiling. Thought about the fact that this was a 6th-ranked knight, Fred, and he was even offended that he considered him a complete vegetable. He told the knight not to listen to the captain and just give it his all. Fred was taken aback when he heard the hero. The young man pointed his sword and shouted that they were going. The trace of a lightning strike passed near the knight's head. Fred parried Aaron's powerful blow. He clenched his teeth from the tension and thought about what it was, because he thought to be gentle with him, but the speed, the feeling of the attack, and even the technique of his sword were beyond the knight's expectations. Fred wondered if this was really the young master he knew. The other boys looked on in surprise and remarked that who would have thought that there would be such a heated battle and that the young master was pushing Fred. The knight defended himself from the attacks and wondered if he was weak. He gritted his teeth and thought about what kind of nonsense this was. The captain noticed and shouted at the little brat about not using mana. A bright light lit up the area and Hunter shouted at the boy. The knight fell to the ground. The spectators sighed scared. Aaron looked at his opponent with his sword and asked if he had won. Fred looked at him and said that he definitely used magic, wondering how that could be. The young man looked at him and calmly told him to just admit his defeat. The boys watching from the side exclaimed that this couldn't be, wondering if young Master Aaron had won the fight. A week ago, a chest with coins was opened. The guy said that fortunately everything was in place. The hero looked into the open chest and thought that this time he would not be deceived like a fool, and he would spend everything properly. The guy pressed the screen and thought that now, for him, the most important way of transaction between dimensions. He got to the page about the exchange. The hero looked, touching his chin, and thought that he would look at the most important thing now. This is, of course, the exchange. Scales appeared from the book. Coins appeared on the scales, and a notification popped up that the estimated number of coins was 30. The hero commented that this was more than he expected. Aaron looked at the system window in surprise and said that he received quite a lot and thought that there would be about 25 coins. He looked in front of him and thought when he finally understood the real price of gold. The guy thought that when he started making deals between dimensions, he understood the main rule that depending on the market situation, the value of goods changes, and in each world, goods have different values. On the table were products, money, precious stones. The young man understood that in order to get the maximum benefit, it is best to buy cheap and sell expensive. Aaron looked closely at the book and understood that the stock exchange was not stupid either, so certain goods have taxes and commissions, and the lower the transaction level, the more restrictions. The hero folded his hands and thought about the fact that to increase the level, there must be real results, and to get real results, the level must be high. To find a normal product at level 0 is like picking a star from the sky. A dilemma of level 0 was reported. A message from Hearthstone popped up about the items he sells. Aaron saw about the mana stone, which is just the thing needed to replenish mana. A chat with Hearthstone was shown, where a correspondence began. The hero paid attention to the nickname, wondering why his name was glowing red. The guy moved his finger across the window, thinking about what he could click once. He opened the seller's profile and noted that this was user information. The young man thought about the fact that all 3 years that he used the deals from the past, hadn't he seen such reports? Aaron continued to correspond and thought that he needed to find out the price first. In the message, Hearthstone answered the question about the price that there were many who sell more expensively, but now he had little goods, so he should hurry. Another notification popped up. The hero noted that a window with information appeared again. The hero thoughtfully looked at the screen and thought that if this information is true, then the seller wants twice as much money and says that the price is market. He is a swindler. The guy smiled and said that how can you sell stones at an exorbitant price? What a nasty swindler. Hearthstone wrote that his price is quite low, asking on what basis he tells him this. They continued to correspond that Aaron will write that he is a swindler, saying that they will explain it to him at the exchange. The hero raised his hand to his chin and thought that the seller was confused, and it seemed like what he saw in the information window. The young man was arguing that he probably knew that he would receive sanctions from the exchange for the wrong price. Aaron wrote about whether he wanted to receive the status of an unreliable seller and restrictions, asking why he was silent, warning that he would go and write a complaint about him. The seller, after a short silence, answered about how impatient the hero was. Hearthstone wrote that in fact, the profitability of the mines had fallen so much in their time, and the workers were also asking for wages, and how he would pay everything so he would have nothing left at all, saying that he did not want to deceive on purpose. The hero looked at the notification about where it was written about a report about a partner entrepreneur using slave labor for mining at the mine who was ready to do anything to make a profit. The guy's eye was emitting light, and he was thinking about why Hearthstone was running him down again. He told the seller that he didn't need such a deal, he would go and write a complaint. The interlocutor begged him not to write a complaint, saying that he would specifically sell it to him for half the price. The hero leaned on his hand and thought about the price, thinking about whether to try to knock the price down again because he could still move. Aaron gave up these thoughts because he could also get it. The deal with Hearthstone began. The cards of the exchange participants were shown. The guy put his hand to the book. Features with cards of a small mana stone and a medium mana stone popped up. The young man thought that this was not bad, and he needed to accept it. A notification about the result of the deal appeared. Aaron opened his eyes wide and wondered why 22.5 coins, because he put 25 coins. The hero reasoned that everything was stranger and stranger. Information about the seller and a report on the deal appeared. Even the number of coins in the deal decreased. Hearthstone asked in the chat if he would write a complaint. The guy crossed his arms and thought that he would not report him, but would keep him on the hook for a while. The guy looked out the window in confusion and wrote that if he continued to sell at this price, he thought about ignoring and exiting. A message appeared called a calculation, from which his head is spinning, in which the cashback effect is applied. Aaron was surprised, wondering what kind of cashback this was, and thought that this was a privilege for VIP clients. The young man spread his hands and thought that it could not be. Why would it be? He held a blue stone in his hand and thought that he should try to absorb mana. The hero closed his eyes and thought that he felt how mana was coming, so it was not a fake. The boy said that after that, he diligently studied the special mana-breathing technique of the Steelguard family for several days, which his grandfather had once improved. In order to master the breathing of steel, 2 conditions must be met. The young man clenched his fist. The faceless man sat in the lotus position when it was said about a strong body and a lot of mana. The hero said that in the beginning it was impossible for him who did not own anything. The boy trained hard, swinging his sword, and said that the first he received through endless effort and training. Shards flew from above onto Aaron's head when he said that the second was due to the purchased mana stones. The young man thought about how he succeeded in mastering the breathing of steel and was able to achieve a glorious victory over the night. The boy closed his eyes and said, exhaling, that he was cool, wasn't he? People wondered if the young master had won. Someone was saying that it was a stage training, that Fred was a good boy and knew how to play along when necessary. The hero smiled when they told him that he had worldly wisdom from such an early age that he had no pride at all, and said that they would still see who would win. He thought about the fact that he would have to prove his strength one more time. Aaron turned his head and asked Michael to compete with him. The young man was distracted and asked if he was talking to him. The hero answered that he was talking to him, thinking that this guy was perfect for demonstrating his abilities. Michael was scared and tried to object to the young gentleman. A girl came up to them and said that it would be interesting. The guys called out to the lady. In front of them stood a girl. This was Robin Stillguard's eldest daughter, Karen. The captain was excited and told her that the young gentleman was still. The girl raised her hand, stopping him, and said that she understood what he was worried about. Karen looked him in the eye and said that if he was worried about the mana competition, he could just have a sword fight. Hunter replied in surprise that it was fine. The opponents looked at each other's faces. The captain from the side told about Michael, a knight of the 6th rank, and in a normal sword fight, he was comparable to the 5th rank. The captain was serious when he said that the main thing in such a fight was the distance, and he was tall, his arms were long, so Michael was very comfortable, thinking that the young master definitely had no chance. Someone exclaimed to look there, asking about the young man pushing Michael. Aaron attacked, swinging his fist at his opponent. A bare-knuckle battle ensued between them. Hunter watched in amazement, and thought that it couldn't be, because a couple of days ago the wind blew him away. The guy delivered a powerful blow to the body. People watched from the sidelines as dust rose. The crowd shouted in bewilderment that Michael had lost. They rejoiced, raising their hands and shouting that it was very cool, chanting the name of the young master. The hero calmly watched what was happening. The girl touched Aaron's face, calling out to him. She came closer to his face and said that her brother was great, and it seemed that the girl had been thinking badly of him all this time. The hero thought about his sister. Fights were shown during training with the girl. Aaron talked about how Robin always regretted that Karen was born a girl. He reasoned that she could not master the breath of steel, which was transmitted only to male steel guards, but her talent was visible to the naked eye. The sister looked away calmly when he spoke about how the breath of steel is the root and foundation of the Steelguard family. It is passed down only through the male line, and no girl can master it. It was said that even if there is a certain talent, because of this condition, girls did not even have a chance, so Karen, like no one else, understood the value of Aaron's days of silent training. The girl stroked the young man's head and said that he tried so hard to achieve this, in secret from everyone, where no one would see. The sister closed her eyes and apologized for underestimating the hero, and after all, she is his older sister. But not that she did not support him, but like everyone else, she condemned him. The guy silently looked at her. He thought that his conscience was gnawing at something. He remembered how he approached the captain with a request, and thought that in fact all this was precisely in order to get recognition from his sister. Karen looked down as Aaron reflected that of all the siblings, she was the one who could see the situation more clearly, without prejudice and full of virtue and insight. The boy was embarrassed and thought that she would be the first to notice and recognize the new hero. The young man looked at her and reasoned that he had no other choice now, apologizing to her. A night castle was depicted as Aaron reflected that so far everything was going as planned, but the question was what would happen next. Dinner that day. The family was sitting at the table. Robin brought the glass to his face and noted that today was especially excellent. Karen looked at her father and said that she asked the servants in the kitchen about it, because Aaron was soon to leave for the academy. Robin looked at him and asked a question about how he was already so grown up. The young man watched and thought that as soon as he drew his sister's attention to himself, she immediately began to take care of him. The father sat on a chair and turned to his son and said that Karen had told him that he had defeated a knight in training. The hero looked at him and thought that he had succeeded. He tilted his head, thinking that his father had finally taken an interest in him and that he could not miss such a chance. The boy stated that he was not yet good enough to defeat the knight. It was only a small sword fight. Robin scratched his chin, surprised. His brother added that he was only rank 6. The young man looked at his father and added that they did not use magic. It was Robin's eldest son's Stillguard Karen. He leaned over, asking his sister if it was true. The hero looked at him tensely and wondered why he had stuck his head out. The girl turned to Karen and pointed out that he had only become a 5th rank knight at 18, while Aaron was only 16. The boy countered, saying that it was in the winter of 17 and that he had officially received the rank after that. His father raised his hand and praised the hero, calling him a fine fellow. Robin stood up and began to tell him that his grandfather had first entered the battlefield at about his age, and asked if there was a reason why he had suddenly come to his senses so abruptly. His father extended his hand to the boy, and he wondered whether to shake his hand. Aaron shook his hand and declared that he was already 16. The hero squeezed his hand and thought about a combat handshake, which was a competitive action where people pass mana through each other's hands. The young man's eyes widened, and he wondered if this was some kind of test. He looked ahead and thought that of course it was important to please his father, but in order to avoid unnecessary suspicions, he needed to hide all skills above rank 3. Robin exhaled, closing his eyes, and noticed that he had grown noticeably, and he was so worried that his youngest was a loser. But now he could relax a little. Karen watched with anger as his father said that it seemed he would be able to show himself well beyond the walls of the steel guards. Robin closed his eyes and said that it was true. It seemed he had paid too little attention to the youngest, and, of course, one could say that he came to his senses too late. His father opened his eyes and added that, as a gift for entering the academy, he asked if he wanted to ask for something. The hero opened his eyes wider and thought about what had happened. The guy scratched his head and said that, of course, there was something. He immediately turned to the side and added that there was nothing, and it seemed to him that this was too much for him. The father crossed his arms and asked to speak and not to worry, and he would try to listen to everything. The young man scratched the back of his head and said that he did not want to ask for something global and was sure that he would be refused. Robin closed his eyes and said that he did not know that their youngest could also control people's souls, adding that if he wanted, he would take an oath. The eldest son jumped up and called his father. Robin put his hand on his chest and began a speech about how he, the head of the Stillguard family, Robin Stillguard, swears by mana that he will not break his promise and will do everything that his abilities allow him to fulfill the request that his son, Aaron Stillguard, will voice. The guy listened in amazement and thought about what he would say now. He looked up at his father and said that his request. A cry was heard appealing to Robin that this was completely impossible. Kieran followed his father and the hero, asking if Aaron had completely gone crazy. He exclaimed that it was impossible to break the family tradition. The eldest son raised his voice in his ear, asking if anyone other than the head could enter the treasury and what kind of visitation he was asking for. Robin turned and said that to be more precise, the right to enter the treasury belonged entirely to the head of the family, but he had entered there before with his father. Kieran looked at him and noted that this was a different case. His father asked in response whether he should break the oath of mana. The young man looked at Robin carefully and said that he should not. His father turned half around and told him to go while he went with the youngest. The hero looked at his brother smiling, thinking that he got what he deserved, and this is what must be done. Kieran clenched his teeth and thought about how Aaron, the bastard, wanted the right to enter, which even he himself did not have. Kieran opened the door with a key and said that the rules were simple. He could only enter the outer treasury, and he should not go inside. Doors opened for the characters, and the father said that the boy could take anything, but only one. He would give him as much time as he needed, so let him choose calmly. The young man glanced inside, answered that he understood, thought about finally holding a real book of dimensional transactions in his hands. The hero looked around the dark room and thought about the fact that the book of dimensional transactions was the most powerful weapon, so that nothing would threaten his new life. Only he should own this book. He walked along the room and thought that before his last death, during the last 100 years, the only 2 traders from the land of 1342 were grandfather Richard and him. The boy thought that, unlike his previous life, when he found this book in the treasury, in this life, he could see the deals in other dimensions in his eye, which meant that most likely the real one was still stored in the treasury. The hero chased away the thought in his head that this is why he wanted to please his older sister to get his father's attention. Aaron looked at the shelf and said that it was definitely somewhere there. He looked in front of him and thought that it was impossible for someone else to find it. He himself must destroy the real book of dimensional deals. Robin crossed his arms and asked if he had chosen. The boy answered that he had. His father looked at his hands in surprise. The young man was holding a knight figure when Robin asked about the hero figure. A golden figurine of a man raises his hand with a sword up. Robin explains that this is a figurine of a hero created to praise Richard, who defended Navarro from the Empire. Its price exceeds 1,000 gold coins at the rate of their state, the thing that is easier than all the others to see in the treasury. The hero's father, looking down, mentally said that this is just a momentary benefit, and then wondered why his son's eye fell on it, and asked if Aaron wanted to enter the treasury just to collect gold. The boy, smiling, looked guiltily. The man with the beard seemed to know what his son was thinking. The blonde boy smiled. The young man, looking at the figurine, replied that this is the most valuable thing for him now, because thanks to it he can buy both a sword and a mana stone and still have money left. Robin, looking down, noted that it is better to spend this time not on buying and selling things, but on hard training. Aaron, lowering his head, answers that he thinks that there is not always only one way. The boy, picking up the figurine, explained that of course, if he has an innate talent for the sword then, as his father says, he is wasting his time. The blonde boy, holding a golden statue, said that maybe, on the contrary, for him it will be the fastest way. The man looked down. Robin, scratching the back of his head, answered that the boy is not so easy to understand. The young man, closing his eyes, thought that he succeeded. Right before that, in the treasury, Aaron, opening his mouth, was surprised. The hero's shadow covered the shelf with books. He realized that the Book of Dimensional Transactions was not here. The protagonist, turning his head, wondered that it might not be here. The yellow-eyed boy, pushing the books aside, said that if it is not there, it will be here. Aaron, looking at the gold lying there, came to the conclusion that the book could be in that direction. The hero, widening his eyes, realized that the book was gone. He put his hands in his pockets and concluded that he needed to think, and then added that he had two hypotheses. The arrow pointed to the book. The protagonist thought that the first hypothesis was that while he had not seen it, the book had moved somewhere. The man with a question mark on his face opened the book. The young guy thought that the second hypothesis was that someone was currently using the Book of Dimension Transactions, and then concluded that he could not confirm any of the hypotheses at the moment. Aaron, putting his hand to his face, thought that 17 years had passed, and if you count from the moment he became an earl, then 14. The boy, lowering his hand, concluded that he had no idea what had happened to the book during this time, and he could only hope that it had not fallen into anyone's hands. Now, the fair-haired guy, sitting down at the table, began to think that finding out that the Book of Transactions was not in the treasury now was already a great achievement, and then mentally added that he, of course, grabbed the first thing that came to hand, but the hero's figurine could bring good money. The hand touched the golden statuette. A notification appeared in front of the hero's face that the automatic transaction was completed. System windows popped up, notifying that the hero needed to make more transactions to level up, that the price support effect was active, and that he had received coins from Sleepy Eyes and from I Love coupons. Aaron, looking at the screen, realized that he still had privileges. The protagonist explained that he had unlocked these privileges during the deal with Gerard. A plaque appeared that applied the effect, thanks to which the hero received a cashback of 3 coins. The fair-haired young man, opening his mouth, thought in surprise that he seemed to have seen a privilege called Account that made his head spin, and this was definitely a privilege for VIP clients, which meant that he could be one too. The boy, spreading his arms, came to the conclusion that this was impossible. Aaron's eyes lit up. He brought his finger to the book. Having pressed the VIP plaque, the young guy said that of course this could not be, but it was worth trying once, and then came to the conclusion that if there was nothing in the VIP category, then he was not a VIP. The protagonist looked down. He looked at the screen in surprise. The information window notified that the hero had different skills of the maximum level. The guy, with the glowing eye, looking down, noted that it was crazy that all his skills were at the maximum level, and then mentally asked how it was even possible to imagine such a thing. Aaron, raising his head, realized that he was given more money for the exchange, which is also a consequence of maximizing the ability. The hero looked at the plate, which informed that the entire commission from his transactions was becoming 0. The protagonist opened a window in which there was a photo of a person and information about him. A notification appeared that an ability called the Eyes of Providence had become available to him, which provide complete information about the seller and a report on the transaction. The young guy, folding his hands, looked at the screen. A plate appeared with an ability called Flow Recognition, which allows you to find out the quantity of goods and the real price. A system window popped up where the result of the transaction was written. A plate appeared with a skill that gives a 10% discount. Aaron, turning his gaze to the monitor, asked why 22.5 coins. The fair-haired boy, crossing his arms in front of the blue book, realized that he started with 10 coins thanks to this privilege. Notifications about bonuses and his skills lit up above him. The protagonist paused thoughtfully. 3 versions of the main character, laughing, ran back and forth. Aaron, holding his face with his hands, realized that in this case he could move mountains. The boy, smiling, concluded that everything would happen even faster than he thought, and this meant that it was time for revenge. The The fair-haired guy, taking the statuette in his hands, noted that he was already ready for battle, so he first needed to get coins from the golden figurine. The golden knight lay on a semi-transparent scale. A notification appeared that the effect was being applied. Aaron, squinting his eyes, thought that he was being taken for a fool because the statuette was not worth 115 coins, but at least 140 or 150 coins. The protagonist, having activated the VIP privilege called flow recognition, looked at the figurine and saw its characteristics. Aaron, grabbing the figurine in fear, shouted where the stock rats had put 40 coins, and then added that 40 coins were 400 gold. He sat down on the bed and thought that he was too lazy, but he needed to make some kind of deal. The protagonist, sprawled on the bed, came to the conclusion that he was already quite comfortable. The protagonist, smiling, said that he was comfortable because he could make deals even while lying down, and this was all because the book of dimensional deals was now in his eye. Looking at the open, ghostly book, realized that it was right in front of his eyes. He opened his eyes wide and mentally asked himself if the book in his eye was really the book of dimensional deals. The young boy looked down and decided that, in that case it was good, of course, that he could walk around without glasses. Notifications popped up, saying that the hero had made a deal on a gold figurine, had received extra coins from a skill called My Dust, and had replenished the number of deals needed to level up. The protagonist, putting his hand to his face, noted that it was selling quickly. Aaron, looking at the transparent book, wondered what product to choose next, and concluded that he would continue to take mana stones for now. A message appeared from a guy in a hood, saying that he was selling cheap and high-quality mana stones. The protagonist's eyes lit up with a blue flame. He, pressing the screen, said that the seller was waiting for him here, and then asked himself if he would try to play today. Aaron sent the seller a message in which he greeted him and called him a scammer. Gerard, angrily clenching his fist, was indignant at being called a swindler and wondered who had written it. The merchant's eyes widened in surprise, and he thought that it was that same guy. The protagonist looked at Gerard's message with interest, and he asked if it was that same buyer, to which Aaron confirmed that it was him, and added that he wanted to buy more mana stones and whether he could do it at the old price. The merchant hesitantly looked away, and said that back then it was a special concession, so now it would be a little different, to which the protagonist sternly asked if it was time to stop lying to him. Gerard himself knew that it didn't work, and added that their previous dialogue was saved, suggesting that they play it safe. The merchant looked down sharply and thought irritably that this guy was a bastard, and added to himself that of course he would only be temporarily blocked. But thinking about the losses over these few days, it would probably be easier to sell to him cheaper. The young man looked at the screen in complete bewilderment and thought that he did not understand how the seller, who had almost 10,000 coins, could be so petty. Gerard sighed heavily, thinking about what he wanted from him, and asked how much he wanted to buy. A message from Aaron appeared in the chat window, in which he asked how much the merchant could give, to which he offered 25 medium and 20 small stones, and the protagonist briefly ordered to download everything, to which Gerard obediently agreed. A system notification appeared in front of the protagonist, which said that the deal was completed. 270 coins were spent on mana stones, and a cashback of 40.5 coins was received, and Aaron thought that he bought medium ones for 10 and small ones for 2.5 apiece. The young man immediately posted a new ad for sale, where medium stones cost 12 coins and small ones 3. Aaron yawned sweetly and said that this is the basis of all deals: you buy cheap, sell expensive, and get a profit, after which the protagonist thought that he needed to take a nap. At the same time, Gerard's room, a gilded hookah fell to the floor with a characteristic sound, and the merchant ominously asked what it was. Gerard furiously slammed his fist on the table and shouted that he was a shameless bastard because he sold him stones cheaper, and he should be grateful and not upload his ad to the same channel. The protagonist looked at his screen in surprise and asked himself why he had received so many messages. Aaron read an angry message from a merchant in which he ordered not to send him question marks and threatened to rip off his head, to which the young man calmly thought that the seller was behaving indecently. The protagonist smiled slyly and thought that he had learned a thing or two in the 3 years he had spent making deals, and told himself that even if the other person raised their voice, they would still not pass through the dimensional wall, mentally calling them a blockhead. Aaron quickly typed a reply, thinking that he could raise his voice twice as much, and wrote that the other person was a bad, evil bastard entrepreneur, asking why he thought he could yell at him. The merchant looked at the message in shock and asked in confusion what kind of speech this was, and in the chat the protagonist asked if the man was offended by being scolded, and remembered that once in a past life he had clashed with an unyielding salesman, and his special manner of speech had forever imprinted itself on his soul. The protagonist sent another insulting message, in which he stated that he hadn't even started yet, and called Gerard a stonehead with a short neck, and added to himself that the merchant was probably not a human, but someone from Azeroth. The merchant looked at Aaron's message and asked him to stop, thinking that it felt so-so, and that the guy was some kind of crazy. The young man looked hopefully at the screen where the merchant wrote that in any case, this was too much, while the protagonist began to receive notifications about receiving 75 coins from the gesture and 45 from the ice merchant. And the protagonist stated that if he had promised not to trade, then maybe he would have done differently. The merchant continued his thought in message, stating that it was impolite to sell at a low price. It would be fine if he sold at the same price, to which Aaron mentally objected that he was only doing this because the merchant, on the contrary, was selling too much. The protagonist sent a message in which he offered to make a deal, to which Gerard replied that he did not want to, and added that he would not sell at that price anymore, and that the young man could write a complaint if he wanted. The protagonist sent a message stating that he was not asking for a lower price, and offered to buy at the market price, but the merchant replied that he was not going to sell at any price, to which Aaron thought how touchy he was. The young man looked at the screen and thought that this was unnecessary, because the merchant could make money, but did not want to make a deal, because of emotions, and added that for guys like Gerard, money is both religion and faith. Aaron sent a message asking if such an outstanding person as Gerard would refuse a deal, and thought that if you properly whet the appetite, such merchants quickly understand that there are things more important than emotions. The merchant read the message, and the protagonist thought that such people are ready to do anything to make a profit, and are easily convinced by the word profit. Gerard sighed, and thought that he was an outstanding person, and, of course, emotions should not interfere with the matter, and asked the interlocutor what the market price was, to which the protagonist replied that this was the price at which he sells a medium stone for 12 coins, and a small one for 3. The young man looked at his balance, and thought that he currently had 455 coins, and his VIP price support privilege allowed him to spend 30% more, that is, 657 coins. Aaron sent a request to buy 50 medium and 19 small stones, to which the merchant replied that he did not have that much goods, and the protagonist asked if Gerard had a mine. The man answered puzzledly that mana stones do not grow from the ground, and the protagonist asked how many were in stock then, and the merchant replied that he had 25 medium ones and 50 small ones. The young man sent Gerard a message that he agreed to the terms of the current deal, and thought that it was good for him anyway. Aaron posted a new, even cheaper ad, and thought that he could sell even cheaper. The merchant furiously sent a message in which he called the protagonist a crazy fool, and asked if he thought about the commission, after which he added that he must have millions under his belt since he was selling so cheaply. The protagonist put his cup down on the saucer, and thought that from the point of view of an ordinary buyer, the merchant was telling the truth. The young man smiled slyly, and thought that for a VIP the story changes, because even if you use all the privileges, the situation will not change. Aaron thoughtfully put his finger to his lips, and thought that even if he lowered the price by 25%, he would still be in the black. The protagonist looked at the restrictions on the sale of mana stones, and thought that they had another advantage, very loose restrictions on sale. Gerard started to type a message, but the protagonist interrupted him, writing that he had little time to earn money and there was no reason to chat with him. An image of blue mana crystals appeared, and the young man continued his story. Aaron looked at the glowing crystals, and thought that since he had free time from work, he needed to absorb mana. The protagonist absorbed mana right on the carpet, and thought that now that he made himself a cool body wherever he went, everything would be fine. But for now, he only quickly coped with the basic requirements. On the shelf nearby stood a portrait of the protagonist's grandfather named Richard, and the young man thought that he was not a real genius. Aaron languidly closed his tired eyes, thinking that if everything remained as it was, he would have shortcomings and stagnation. The protagonist suddenly looked ahead, and thought that if this were to happen, then when he went up there, he would not be able to survive there. The protagonist washed his face with ice water, and thought that there was very little time left before going there. The young man looked ahead resolutely, and thought that, in general, it was time for the calculations. Aaron banged his fist on the wall of the sink, and decided that it was time to begin. The protagonist posted a new ad in which he lowered the price of medium stones to 9.5 coins, and notifications of completed transactions immediately poured in. Water was dripping from the protagonist's face, and the young man thought that it would start very soon. Aaron thought about the fact that in his past life, in order to go there, he had to give himself completely for the entire year. The protagonist thoughtfully looked at his reflection in the mirror, and thought that in this life, only 8 days had passed since he began making transactions across dimensions. An image of a castle towering tens of meters appeared, and the protagonist remembered that when he owned Stillguard, it took a whole year. The young man looked mysteriously in the mirror, and said to himself that now he had reached the necessary level of transactions much faster. Aaron received a system notification that the protagonist had made enough trades to level up, and he excitedly exclaimed that he had done it. A new notification said that he had made enough trades to level up to level 1, and that he could now enter level 1 channels. An image of the stock exchange settings appeared, and the System 1 icon lit up red. The protagonist calmly pursed his lips, thinking that he had finally. The young man's eye lit up, and he thought that he had finally activated the move to System 1. A welcome message to System 1 appeared in front of the protagonist. Aaron narrowed his eyes sarcastically and thought that everything was just beginning. A notification appeared in front of the protagonist about unlocking the sponge inside the head skill, which increases the speed of assimilation of information, events, and skills, and he thought that he had finally moved on to System 1. The young man crossed his arms and thought that this was a system where even errand boys and restaurant workers became as strong as knights, or the world of Nyerem. The protagonist read a message in the chat from a user who wrote that he had received the indulgence of a god in his world, but did not have the necessary tools to express it, and invited others to offer a suitable price for help. Aaron looked at the screen and thought, what a disgusting manner of communication this guy had. In the chat, comments appeared under the guy's message from other users who did not understand what he was talking about and thought he was an idiot, after which the author of the ad himself replied that he needed a sword for martial arts, and the protagonist thought that it was no wonder that everyone reacted like that. The young man looked in surprise at the system notification, which said that the sponge inside the head skill had reached the maximum level, the side effect was reduced, and the absorption speed was increased by 300%. The protagonist looked at the screen in confusion and asked himself why everything was so sudden. Aaron put his finger to his chin thoughtfully and thought about what it would take to unlock the privileges. The protagonist continued his thoughts, thinking that there was only one thing he could do. The young man activated the Eye of Insight, which, according to the description, shows information about who is being traded with and the report of the exchange center. Aaron looked at the screen in confusion and wondered if the Eye of Insight was not working. The protagonist sighed in disappointment and thought how disappointing it was, and that the guys from the center were useless. The protagonist crossed his arms over his chest and thought that they should at least tell him why he got the privileges or let him see the reason through the Eye of Insight. The young man smiled slyly and thought that, well, he could figure it out himself anyway. Aaron looked ahead and thought that privileges probably unlocked with leveling up. A window with the inscription "Event" suddenly flashed in front of the protagonist, to which he asked in surprise what kind of event. Many windows with various events appeared in front of the protagonist, such as a special sale of scrolls, a time of attack without a commission and juicy discounts, to which he thought in shock what it was, and how many things there were. The protagonist looked at the event windows and thought about what he wanted to say, but after thinking about whether this was too strange, the young man continued his thoughts, thinking that even if it was a special sale, the discounts depended on the market price, so it would still be expensive, and the lack of a commission did not matter because of his privilege level. Aaron read the private message from the exchange center, congratulating him on switching to System 1 and giving him 3 coupons, and wondered if this was a customer service. The protagonist examined one of the coupons, which offered a dancing image and 3 years of internal energy for 500 coins, and wondered if they gave him some cheap stuff as a reward, then asked in surprise what this was and what maximum body and sword stealth was. A notification appeared in front of the protagonist that the head sponge would absorb the effect, and after the absorption was complete, he cried out, wondering if it was really absorbed. The young man thoughtfully put his finger to his chin and thought that this meant that the martial arts of this world used mana as fuel, but in System 1, they used internal energy. With the image of a mysterious blade in the background, the protagonist thought that if someone asked him which was better, he would undoubtedly answer that the martial arts in System 1, and that this strange sword technique seemed out of this world. Aaron continued his thought, thinking that martial arts were similar and that they used the power of nature, but mana was in a more natural state, while internal energy was a refined version of mana. The protagonist looked at his hand and thought that although this new privilege made the skill more refined, it was compatible with the mana core, and he still had to open his meridians and veins. The protagonist closed his eyes and thought that this made his skill more refined. Suddenly, the young man, who was enveloped in red energy, opened his shining eyes wide. The protagonist put his hand on his chest and declared that instantly creating Dantian and learning a sword technique was more amazing than he ever thought. The protagonist looked away with concern and wondered if there was a limit to this spatial trade, since he could buy anything if he had money. The young man looked at the image of his 500 coins and thought that he could even buy abstract values, then declared that he needed to be careful with the use of coins. An image of traditional Japanese patterns appeared, and the protagonist thought that now that he had finished his preparations, it was time for him to head to his first target, adding that he should start with that guy named Samuel, who was a spatial exchange merchant. A red glow emanated from the depths of the cave, and the merchant Samuel enthusiastically called the protagonist his customer, whom he adored, and asked how he could help him, to which Aaron told him to stop talking like that, because it was rude, and the merchant assumed that the young man belonged to a different species. The merchant sat hunched over on the floor and asked the protagonist to think of it as love for the human species and not love for the dimension, to which the young man said that he needed martial arts scrolls and asked to show the assortment. The merchant grinned maliciously and replied that he sold a lot of things, but asked to refrain from such formalities, to which Aaron asked if it was important to him and suggested that he also communicate like that. The merchant lowered his head in annoyance and thought that he had another bad customer. Samuel activated his device, which said that the protagonist's name was Aaron, that he was a first-level merchant, and that his soul image was a fairly well-trained warrior, and told the interlocutor that he needed to look at the assortment, and added to himself that it looked like it was from a small fry of the lower system. The merchant thoughtfully put his hand under his head and thought that he was not the one to complain. After all, he lived off of such customers. Fresh blood flowed from Samuel's hand, and he added that he should thank his customers. Hot blood began to drip profusely onto the stone floor, and the merchant asked the protagonist what kind of martial arts he was interested in, stating that he had a couple of sword techniques, including triple sword techniques, sword balance techniques, and a crouching tiger technique. The protagonist smiled confidently and thought to himself that this was the thing, because no matter how many times he listened, he could not understand this strange manner of speech, the repertoire of this swindler, Samuel. The merchant gestured vigorously with his hands, and the young man stated that this man's specialty was selling random cheap scrolls at an inflated price, adding that, for example, the triple sword technique was an incomprehensible technique that contained all sword techniques, and that, of course, at the beginning, the progress would be insignificant, but it had limitless potential, and if he succeeded in mastering it, he could become the strongest in the world. But the protagonist, suddenly, remember that the merchant only chose System 0 people who dreamed of System 1 martial arts. The protagonist's eyes lit up with excitement, and he thought that the merchant was choosing people like Aaron himself, who were real weaklings in their past life. The young man leaned down on the floor and said in frustration that he had been deceived again, and added that the triple sword technique was a normal technique containing 3 movements: stabbing, cutting, and blocking. The protagonist asked again with a cheerful grin and poorly concealed sarcasm whether he would become the strongest if he mastered it, and thought, ironically, that it would be useful if used by the strongest in the world. The merchant continued to say, with a sarcastic grin, that one technique would not be enough for the hero, and that he had others such as the body illumination technique, the internal cultivation technique, the piercing technique, the striking technique, and many others, and asked the protagonist if he was silent because he had not yet decided which art to choose, and readily offered that he could give a couple of pieces of advice if he paid another 20 coins. Aaron looked thoughtfully in front of him and firmly said okay, but thought to himself that this was not Samuel, and said his real name, the 5th world of Nurum, the mountain bamboo sector. The subordinate excitedly shouted the name of the leader, to which he sharply asked what happened. The leader of the mountain bamboo sect, named Chuck, turned his head to the side and asked if they were talking about the bastard named Samuel, and worriedly added if they had found him. Chuck tensely slammed his fist on the table and asked how they had found him, what kind of source it was, and asked if they were sure of it. The manager of the spatial sucked to turn his back to the leader and relayed what the protagonist had said. Chuck carefully read Aaron's message, in which he wrote that he had many questions, he could not answer them all at once, and added that he was quite upset right now. The protagonist sent a new message to the chat, in which he asked if the sect members would reward him if he took care of their enemy. The leader of the sect, having read the message, indignantly raised his hand and thought incredulously that his trust could not be gained with sweet words, and that perhaps the young man was just an ordinary swindler. The protagonist calmly spread his hands and sent a new message, in which he wrote that if they did not believe him, then it was bad, and that he would just let Samuel go, since he was not his enemy. Chuck angrily clenched his fist and asked the protagonist in the chat if he had called him to joke. Aaron took a sip from his mug and calmly replied that this was not so, and advised him to look at his information. Chuck thoughtfully placed his hands on the table and said that the young man was from the lower system. The protagonist flashed his red eye and sent a message in the chat asking how, in Chuck's opinion, he knew about the secrets of their book of techniques. Chuck pressed his lips together in bewilderment. The leader of the sect folded his hands together and realized that Samuel had told the protagonist about this, which meant that he was also a traitor. Aaron sent a message praising Chuck's intelligence with a slight grin, adding that for a fugitive like this merchant, there was no better backup than the Dimension Deal book. A notification appeared on the screen about receiving 200 coins from the leader of the Mountain Bamboo sect. Chuck spat out water from his mouth in surprise. In the chat, the leader of the sect excitedly asked if this was enough and asked to understand their position, and the protagonist looked at the screen in surprise and said to himself that this was too much. The protagonist looked thoughtfully into the distance and thought that he simply wanted to return the 20 coins he spent at the merchant. The merchant smiled grimly, and the young man thought that Samuel would never know that these 20 coins were the point of no return for him. A new message from Chuck appeared in the chat, warning the protagonist not to deceive him and promising a large reward for capturing Samuel. The protagonist looked at the screen with enthusiasm and thought about what unexpected luck he had. Information about Samuel appeared on the screen, and the young man thought indifferently that he could just let him go. An image of a notification about the sale of old books appeared, and the protagonist said to himself that his first reason for joining the system was one Sebastian, a first-class seller of martial arts scrolls, and added that it would not be an exaggeration to say that he was the harbinger of the death of the Stilgard family. Aaron wrote with a quill on a piece of paper and said that he met the guy while looking for martial arts scrolls to continue the legacy of his grandfather. The young protagonist looked in front of him in horror and swore in despair that he would kill him. An image of a battle whip appeared, and the protagonist thought about who had deceived him and made him waste his money, and added to himself how his family had finally fallen after buying the bookmark of desires from a man from a second system. The young man looked into the distance with his red eye and thought that this did not remove his resentment toward Sebastian. The protagonist clenched his fist and swore that he would return all the shame and pain he had gone through. In the new chat, the merchant cordially greeted the protagonist and politely asked if he was looking for something specific, offering diploma papers or books of change. Aaron began to type a message in which he wrote that Samuel introduced him to him, to which Sebastian replied that he understood and asked for a second, and the antagonist calmly thought that since he found him through Samuel, he probably already knows a lot. A notification appeared giving information about Sebastian, saying that he is a person with the image of the soul of a person with useful techniques. An image of Aaron's screen notification appeared, stating that the merchant was a scam librarian who stole scrolls and sold them at exorbitant prices to newbies, making a fortune from it, and that he should be treated with caution. Sebastian asked in the chat if that bastard Samuel was still scamming people with the triple technique, adding that only complete idiots would fall for that, to which the protagonist laughed and thought that it was painful, but he was probably scamming people from those systems. The merchant raised his hand to his forehead and thought irritably that Samuel was just a bastard, and wondered when he would get rid of this bad habit. Sebastian narrowed his eyes, and the protagonist sent him a message asking if he was different from Samuel, to which the merchant replied that it was rude to compare him to him, and advised him not to go beyond the bounds. The young man smiled wickedly and wrote to forgive his rudeness, thinking to himself that he needed to hold on, and added if he could see the assortment, specifying that he was looking for sword techniques. Sebastian put his hand to his chest in surprise and asked again about the sword techniques, deciding that one of them would do. The merchant showed Aaron the Plum Blossom Technique scroll, a technique that gave off a pleasant aroma, and asked how about this option, to which the protagonist thought that it was good. The protagonist looked at the device's screen in amazement and thought that this was not a bad technique and asked what the price was. An image of the device's screen appeared and Sebastian replied that the market price would be 50 coins, but since it was his first time, he would sell it for 35, while the young man saw that the real market price was 15 coins and wondered to himself if the merchant was laughing at him. The protagonist looked at the screen in confusion and was mentally outraged that Samuel was selling cheap equipment for 5 coins, and this one was asking 20 on top of the price, and Sebastian asked in the chat why he was not responding and whether he would buy. Sebastian sent a message that he would take this equipment, since 35 coins was not that much, and offered to make an exchange immediately, thinking that Sebastian would pay for it. The merchant happily threw up his hands and said that he was not only rich, but also had a keen eye, and asked how he made money. The protagonist grinned sarcastically and sent a message in which he asked if Samuel hadn't told him, and added that he also worked in this business, and they would meet often. Sebastian looked at the message in surprise, and thought that the young man was talking about this business without even knowing the market price and class of equipment. The merchant happily folded his arms and stated that customers were always welcome as the protagonist, and offered to be friends, to which Aaron replied that it sounded good, thinking to himself that he would not let this weakling go. The protagonist received a friend request from Sebastian, and tapped the screen, and thought that the antagonist took the bait. Another ad appeared, looking for a sword technique, and the young man thought that he would resell the scroll at a reasonable price, even if he lost a little. The protagonist put his hands behind his head with cold determination, and thought that Sebastian could laugh, while he could. The protagonist turned around when someone knocked on the door, and a female voice said that it was Isabel, to which Aaron replied that she should come in. Isabel awkwardly entered the room and apologized. The girl opened her eyes in surprise, turning to the young master. The protagonist turned around and asked in surprise what was wrong. The protagonist put his hand to his face in fear, and immediately realized that his murderous intent had burst out and cursed that he hadn't been able to control it since meeting Sebastian. The young man smiled guiltily and said that it wasn't the girl's fault. Isabel looked at the protagonist and timidly asked if he wanted anything, reminding him that he had even missed his morning training, to which the protagonist replied that he was in excellent condition. The young man's white shirt lifted up. Isabel, looking at him, thought that he had made a lot of progress in a couple of days. The girl awkwardly turned her head away. Aaron noticed her surprised face and wondered why she was blushing. The protagonist's face was covered in yellow flower petals, and he said to himself that this would be tiring. The protagonist ruffled his hair and wondered if she really saw him as a man, since he had not even unlocked half of his potential yet, and she was already looking at him like that. Isabel timidly addressed the young master. The protagonist narrowed his eyes and replied that she should not be shy to ask for anything. Isabel timidly looked at Aaron and began to talk about the matter with young Master Robin this morning. The protagonist frowned and remembered that he had dealt with his brother. Robin glared at his brother, calling him younger, to which the young man replied that he was his older brother. The protagonist narrowed his eyes tiredly. Kieran walked up to his younger brother and called him. He turned around. They looked at each other. Aaron asked what brought him to the training ground, since his brother usually does not train with the knights, since their skills are nothing compared to his. He only asked where he got that idea from. The protagonist smiled and replied that anyone would understand this at first glance, since his brother does not show up at the training ground and instead trains in a corner on his own, and thought that apparently his brother is still a child. Kieran frowned and asked the younger if he was crazy. Aaron slightly turned his head and apologized, saying it was just a joke, and asked what his brother's question was. His brother lowered his head. He swung his hand at the antagonist and said that he needed to teach him a lesson first. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise. He dodged a blow and thought that his brother had always been easy to hurt, but this was too much. Kieran turned around. Aaron crouched down and thought about the reason for his brother's upset. Kieran frowned at him and said that the younger one was asking for it. He swung his hand and told his brother not to think that he was better just because his father praised him. Aaron's hand caught fire. The brothers clashed fists. The older one lost face. He flew back from the younger one's blow. Kieran looked tiredly at the protagonist and asked where this strength came from and wondered if he shouldn't be a simple 5th-ranked knight. The elder's hand was ablaze with lightning. He wondered if he had let his guard down. He declared that he would not hold back any longer. Aura is the true beginning of the mana enhancement technique and the basic requirement for a rank 2 knight. The antagonist looked at his brother's hand in shock and asked him if he had gone crazy and why he had gone so far. He thought that he was still pretending to be a rank 5 knight, so he could not use the aura here. Sweat broke out on his forehead. He declared that his brother had crossed all boundaries. His brother's hand was ablaze. He shouted that he would use this opportunity to teach a real lesson. Kieran took a running start. Aaron thought that his brother was attacking him with all his strength and that since he had no choice, he would have to fight him. The antagonist took a stance. The brothers' fists collided. Aaron used a stone-destroying strike. Kieran's face darkened. He hung in the air and wondered how his brother could be so strong. The younger one landed. He threw one arm back. Aaron looked at his defeated relative. He was lying on the ground and screaming how his brother became so strong. The protagonist smiled. He began to slowly approach his brother, saying that he could not say that they were getting along well, but did not the elder one think that he had gone too far this time? Kieran began to stand up. He asked if this was the power of the secret vault and what his brother had gotten from the secret vault. Kieran's eyes widened in surprise. He realized that Kieran was upset about him entering the secret vault and said that this is why his brother was like this. Because he should have been in the secret vault by now, if not the inner one, then at least the outer one. Kieran frowned but asked what the outer storage was, and if his brother was making fun of him, and added how he could enter the secret storage since the only person who went there besides his father was him. Aaron opened his eyes and was surprised that he was really the only one who went there besides his father, and that his father probably didn't even know about the existence of a dimensional transaction book, and that he didn't use it in his past life either. The ghostly figure looked down. The boy continued that the probability of someone actually using the dimensional transaction book was low, since he had never been to the inner storage. There were 2 options, either it was in the inner storage or it didn't exist at all. Aaron tilted his head thoughtfully. He concluded that the inner storage was much more difficult to get into than the outer storage. Isabel called out to him. He smiled and said that nothing special happened between him and his brother, and he simply asked to show his aura, but he lost control of his power in the process. The girl opened her mouth and asked him if he was hurt, and if he wanted she could bandage him. A blush appeared on her face. She thought that the young master was already an adult, so he wouldn't like it. He replied that he was fine and thanked her for her concern. Aaron closed his eyes. He thought that he would take a pill from the first aid kit and told the girl that he was fortunately lucky. The boy smiled and thought that thank goodness his older brother didn't take out all his displeasure on him, and added that Isabel shouldn't worry and should rest. She bowed and agreed. The protagonist turned around and said that now they needed to find a way to get into the inner storage. He thought that he had to get there before he entered the academy, so he only had a little time left. His gaze froze. He said that it was high time for that incident he would take advantage of them. At the same time, Kieran looked down. He said under his breath that it was impossible. His sister looked at him as he continued that it couldn't be. Irene bit her lip and noted that it seemed like her brother had embarrassed himself. He slammed his fist on the table and stated that Aaron was clearly hiding something, as he had been pretending to be weak until today. The girl shook her head and asked who didn't know about this, and added that Kieran thought his brother was a bear, but he turned out to be a cunning fox. The blonde looked down. His sister continued that even so, the younger one was still just a child, and noted that he hadn't revealed his true nature because he was tired of being teased by his older brother. He disagreed and noted that Aaron hadn't even used all of his strength, and that you could feel him holding back. Irene put her fingers on his chin and said that even if that was the case, he was most likely just a stronger fox. Kieran frowned. He stated that he was not a fox, not a leopard, and that he could be a real tiger. The girl put her hand on her side, while the guy continued that they needed to find out what the younger was hiding from them and what he was planning to do. Irene put her hand to her chin and agreed, adding that he could leave it to her. Her gaze became stern. She said that she would get to the very last detail of his secret. Correspondence of the Merchant Alliance discussing Aaron. Gerard closed his eyes in irritation and ordered them to stop, adding why they should quarrel among themselves, because they had a common enemy. The merchants agreed with him anyway. Correspondence talking about a common enemy. Gerard's eyes narrowed. He asked if his colleagues were just going to sit and watch Aaron's arrogance, and suggested that they start creating a plan to eliminate the common enemy. The spoon touched the food, and someone thought that the prices of mana stones began to fall. His eye glows, and he says that everything is happening faster than expected. He takes 2 cubes with a spoon. Then he throws them into the liquid, because the mana stones he sold were worth 1 coin less than their market price. The water stopped splashing, and the other merchants got angry at him because he reduced the average price. He drinks from a mug and says that this is not a problem, because he will still make a profit thanks to VIP privileges. A screen appears near him where there was an inventory with items. A notification comes that his inventory is full of 34 items. Looking at the screen, he thinks that at the moment he has 1,002 coins and can generally sell medium stones cheaper than usual. Selling small stones for less than 2 coins isn't profitable. Aaron holds the mug and says that the profit from medium stones of the variety is now 1 coin. There is little drink left in the mug, and he says that they are falling in price faster than expected and cannot influence this. Holding a fork, he thinks that now he should worry about something else. There is a piece of cake on the plate. His eye is red, and he thinks that he will take everything from him. Ethan holds a package and says that this is a catalog. In it, they are arranged by strength of force. We see the main character, and he thinks that it is so expensive because this is not a stall. Looking seriously, he understands that this is not enough. Opening his mouth, he offers him a unique primary skill of their Thousand Swords library. We see a red screen, where a set of unique primary skill locks of 1,000 swords is described. Closing his eyes, he is surprised by the prices. We see a red building because this is a sect with great influence. Even in the 5th Miram system, its influence cannot be compared even with the Mountain Bamboo sect. Putting his hand to his chin, he decides to check something. Smiling, he asks what exactly. Holding a scroll in his hands, the man says that he has been waiting for it all day. We see the 2 screens he asked for yesterday. Opening his mouth, he didn't think he could get it, and so quickly. The guy with glasses says that the whole team was looking for them and they can't keep the customers waiting. Aaron smiles and wants one more thing. Raising his hand, he says that Hunter, the rich guy he serves, is a real martial arts fanatic. It's hard to please him with a mid-level martial arts book. Opening his mouth, he says that he will help him. Putting his hand to his chin, he thinks about showing him something more than many small ones. His eyes widen because he doesn't understand what he means. He sits at the table and tells him about the unique primary skill of the Thousand Swords Castle. We see a red screen because the martial arts of the 3rd or 4th world of Miram are also good. Opening his mouth, Sebastian decides to give it a try. His eye glows because the man fell for the trick. Looking at the screen, he asks for an advance payment. We see a letter in his glasses because he was given 200 coins and decides to contact him in 5 days. standing behind the man. He thinks that they are the only ones in the entire library, and he must not get caught. Ethan smiles and they turn to him. Opening his mouth, he asks what would happen if someone tried to sell a unique primary skill somewhere else. Starting to laugh, he asks what kind of crazy martial arts master would think of stealing from divine swords. Sebastian is standing behind the shelf, and Ethan says that he is ready to swear on his honor that if this happens, the person will regret it. A smile appears on his face because the first step is completed. He pulls himself up because the problem is that he needs to find 1,000 coins. We see a yellow building. Aaron is sitting on a bench. Scrolling through the screen, he thinks that the reserves of media mana stones are rapidly running out. In the dialogue, they asked about buying media mana stones, but then they send him away because they won't sell him anything. The guy pokes his finger. Looking near the screens, they write to him to throw compassion in the trash. Opening his mouth, he says that the answers are more aggressive than he thought. Suddenly, Aaron notices 2 girls. The girl looks down and is asked to spit it out. His eyes widen sharply. Suddenly one of them is hit on the cheek. He opens his mouth and is silent. Isabel has a red scar on her face. Irene holds her hand up.